Hello there, so how do you think maps are made? This isn't a trick question with some deep secondary meaning. I'm asking something really simple. Maps are made by opening the editor, placing circles, and drawing sliders on the playfield. That's how all maps are created. Right? When playing, that's all we see, objects on the screen, but we don't really see how those objects are created and arranged by a mapper. Because it's the most intuitive way, new mappers usually handle everything in the editor manually. They place every individual circle, draw every slider node by node, and move them around the playfield by clicking and dragging. This is the most natural type of workflow, but it's also as inefficient as possible. And I realize in the past, I've never made that clear enough. A while back, I made a video about the editor. It explains the basic necessities of mapping, like how to place objects, what buttons do, what drop-down menus are for, and so on. It's a tightly packed compilation of everything someone with zero experience needs to use the editor. And I think it sucks. It states what tools are available in the editor, but because it's so condensed, it doesn't explain how to most effectively use them. The different ways mappers organize objects relies on how they use the editor, and that's often overlooked by anyone learning to map. To best understand what I mean, let's talk about Monstrata. Considering he's one of Osu's most prolific mappers, I can safely assume you've played at least one of his maps before, like the double Tatoe remix, the winning entry to the second Aspire contest, or the highest voted map in the Best of 2016 competition. Through his various accomplishments, he's proven himself to be a top-tier mapper in a relatively short amount of time compared to most others, and I think a big part of why is how he effectively uses the editor. Monstrata's earliest maps are what earned him the reputation of the triangle mapper. They used a concept wherein every object was organized within an isometric grid, which is basically a bunch of triangles. There's clear relationships between any two objects at all times, which is a definite step up from the apparently random placements of most new mappers. I could go on all day about how organized mapping is good, but that's not what I want to focus on here. Instead, I want to talk about the mechanics of how it's done. How exactly does Monstrata create this grid? Considering how precise the triangles are, it definitely wasn't done by hand. Guessing coordinates may look okay at a glance, but when developing something of this scale, irregularities make themselves pretty clear. One actual possibility could be the polygon creation tool. It's made to create perfect triangles, so it technically sounds ideal, but it's also not efficient at all. Instead, what I'm fairly certain he does do is something far simpler, faster, and easier than this. He creates each object in the grid as necessary through simply copy-pasting objects and rotating them. For example, if he wanted the next object in this sequence to be over here, he'd copy and paste the two already existing points of the triangle, rotate them by 120 degrees, move one circle under another, and delete the unused circle. It's a perfect triangle in every situation, and with enough practice, doing any variation of this can be just as easy as eyeballing a triangle, while still achieving a better result. Yes, it does sound really straightforward, but you'd be surprised by how many mappers choose those less effective methods. So, by mapping like this, Monstrata rarely placed circles at all. They came about by copy-pasting pre-existing circles and rotating them to fit his triangular grid. That being said, sliders in Monstrata's early maps follow the same logic. Instead of drawing every individual slider, he drew some base sliders, then copied, pasted, and rotated or scaled them as needed. There were no inconsistencies in how curved sliders were because he'd never attempt to recreate the same curve twice. There were no inconsistencies between parallel sliders because he would scale one slider to fit whatever length he needed. And there was always still clear reasoning for each slider's placement, since they almost all fit within the isometric grid. The only sliders which broke this logic were done in accordance with changes in the music for the sake of contrast, something a player would expect and something Monstrata acted on. Overall, this triangle-centric copy-paste way of mapping worked great. It was efficient and more organized than even maps from experienced mappers. However, after so many maps designed the same way, players started to get tired of it. Every isometric grid map looks the same, and so they're easy to criticize for being repetitive, especially when they're all coming from the same mapper. In response, Monstrata shifted his way of mapping to focus on slightly more complex design, while still maintaining neat organization through his strict usage of the editor. Even though triangles were the main thing players got out of Monstrata's older maps, they still did include other geometry, which was also formed entirely through commands in the editor. To create something like this, Monstrata would start with any two circles, coordinates, then copy, paste, and rotate them by 90 degrees until he had a perfect square. To get one object in the center, he would then take any two opposing corners, copy, paste, and scale them by 0.5, and move one circle under either of the corners to achieve a perfectly centered object. Again, it sounds obvious, I know, but most mappers would go the more intuitive yet inefficient routes. They'd maybe estimate placements for a square and the object in the middle, which might look a bit odd. Or they'd open the polygon creation tool, slowly make a square, move it on the playfield wherever they desire, then, I guess, eyeball the circle in the middle and live with the slight imperfection. Monstrata's way of handling this through basic editor functions is far more effective, especially when it accounts for a whole map of organized placements rather than just one pattern. So yeah, Monstrata's maps shifted from a mainly triangular grid to a variety of different patterns formed through similar means. They were less repetitive and therefore received less criticism, despite being logically the same for the most part. That was good enough, but around this time was also when Monstrata took his mapping to the next level by implementing gimmicks and themes. For example, this is essentially a parody of Monstrata maps, created by Monstrata. Everything in it is a triangle because that's what he's known for, but it's expressed through more than just his culturally trademarked isometric grid. Every three objects forms a triangle in some way, not just jumps and slider patterns, but also slider bodies and streams through a number of different methods. It's absurd how many ways it uses its simple idea, and I think that's the point. It shows that the logic behind his ordinary maps has more potential. Each part of the map uses triangles to represent the song in one way or another, and I don't think that's something anyone could do as easily as Monstrata. That isn't just because he's the triangle guy, of course, it's because of how he uses the editor. Everything on the map is pixel perfectly arranged because Monstrata is accustomed to copying, pasting, rotating, and scaling every object when designing his maps. It's stuff that's really simple and anyone could theoretically do, but few actually attempt because they're not really comfortable with it. This isn't just true for that triangle map either. All of Monstrata's maps follow the same core pattern design created via editor tools, while presenting new ideas simultaneously. His can-do map set is a perfect example of this, wherein each difficulty has a different identity, but still is organized by using the editor in the same way. Out of all his ranked maps, the only exception to these strict copy-pasting concepts appears to be this map. It distinctly goes against the whole idea of copy-pasting every slider in exchange for intentionally designing every slider body in a different way. Still though, each slider shape shares similar characteristics, the sharp edges, the exact 90-degree angles, and so on, which means they can be associated with the music in the same way as copied and pasted sliders. Musical reasoning aside though, how does Monstrata create these sliders? We know by now he's not the kind of guy who would draw a slider without perfect precision, but what other options are there? Unlike circles or sliders, you can't copy, paste, and rotate slider anchors. Or can you? This star slider shape is essentially a combination of different straight lines. Like this is one line, this is another, etc. I can easily replicate this with individual sliders. I've got two sliders of the same length here. Then by copying, pasting, and rotating them by 72 degrees 5 times, I've got a full star. Now, to make it into one huge slider shape, things get a bit trickier. Every map is stored in a .osu file, the contents of which can be manually adjusted with any text editor. Down here, under Hid Objects, I can find a single line of code representing each of my sliders. These numbers on each line are coordinates for a slider's anchors, excluding the head anchor, which is these two numbers at the beginning. By copying and pasting the tail coordinates of the second slider into the first, I can get this shape. But it doesn't quite work as intended. Gray anchors are used for curves, while red anchors are used for sharp angles. So this is definitely breaking something. To get a red anchor here, I just need to copy and paste the same coordinates again and, well, now it's red. So by pasting each slider tail coordinate into my first slider twice, I can ultimately get a star. I just need to wiggle a node here and it'll appear as a slider. Then I can adjust the slider velocity to fit whatever rhythm I want. Pretty cool, honestly, even if it's not just effective usage of the editor. The reason I believe Monstrata creates complex sliders like this is because his map has a bunch of sliders with red anchors on their tails. Tails don't need red anchors to function like this, gray works fine, so it's very likely that they're just a result of copying and pasting coordinates. Well, and he live streams mapping. That's a boring answer though. But yeah, the main thing to take away from all this is how using the editor affects mapping. Most mappers would never do something as complex as this because drawing every individual node seems a lot more intuitive. Learning to map is about forming habits, and if your habits for object arrangement are inefficient, you might be hindering yourself at the moment and in the future. Monstrata formed habits of using the editor's tools as much as possible early on, so he's been able to advance his mapping at a rate most other mappers couldn't compete with. He truly knows the value of using the editor to its fullest extent, and therefore teaches his mentees in the mentorship program how to use the editor as well through this pattern creation practice map. Meanwhile, people like me learn to map by placing every object one by one, and in turn struggle to map the same way as Monstrata. Even though I prefer maps with definite reasons for every object placement down to the exact pixel, and I understand how to make them by analyzing the most organized mappers, I grew accustomed to using the editor less efficiently, and therefore can't easily replicate the cleanest mapping styles. But at the very least, I can try. I've been steadily using different editor tools with more and more precision, so my maps have been getting more and more organized. I'm pretty satisfied with what I've been able to create recently, even though it doesn't feel as natural as freely placing objects. Anyway, thanks to these guys for supporting this video, and I'll see you next week.